Next question is about Mr. Dudley, and I think one of the best monologues. One of the saddest things is the mom. It shows when the mom and the dad are
Mrs.
unpacking
Dudley.
stuff, and they're going through
yeah,
stuff, and it's where they have all this rope because of the construction, which will later kill Nell.
Yeah.
On top of the staircase, and she goes, she's teasing him, and she goes, I see our forever house after being in this house, and she goes, but you better move that rope. I can see the kids swinging from the top. Said jokingly, but it came true.
But it came true.
And so the next question is, in episode 7, we also find out that this house is rotting from the inside out. It's not merely a plot device to move the story further, but the rot and the mold become symbols of something toxic that people cannot live around. Ergo, the house is also toxic, a different poison to different members of the family, especially the mother, Olivia. Furthermore, Mr. Dudley's story in this episode comes out when he tells what happened to him and the wife and why they never stay after dark. This exemplifies Hill's House toxicity and how they lost a child, but staying in Hill House, they could hear the cries of their unborn daughter. It influences both people, both families, body and mind. How does the house slowly prey upon people that are living in it? Give examples where how it wears down its inhabitants until they don't know what's real.
I was having this conversation with a student this last week.
Oh, were you?
And she was talking about how, because she's upfront about how her mental condition is and how she's been in an asylum before and that kind of thing.
She was honest with you about that.
Yeah, and she grew up in Trinity Forest in that place, and she was
a lot of spiritual stuff up there.
Yeah, and so she was telling me about the stuff she has seen and the dreams she has about her children. And her mother, like, she related it to her, like, motherly instincts or her connection to her kids or stuff like that. Yeah.
But it's probably something spiritual that she can pick up on.
And she kept saying, it's about something in the mind. And I'm like, well,
I think it
could be that way. And I think you're probably right. But I said, but a lot of people also say some of that stuff is spiritual. And it was a really interesting conversation we just had about that, because in my mind, it's one of those things where you want to say what you want to say.
But how do you say it?
But how do you, but
you want to do it in a way that's not like,
it's, there's a time and place for it.
There's a time and a place. Exactly.
Me and her can have that conversation, but not everybody can. And
maybe not this conversation.
Not this conversation, yeah. Exactly. But she was telling me this. I'm like, and I was like, was it in the same place? She's like, I had this dream again. I was like, was it in the same place? She's not. No, is it different? And I was like,
interesting.
Oh, it's spiritual.
Other generation.
So it was just really fascinating, because she basically said that she was able to have dreams, and basically it's deja vu. Like, I've had dreams like that where, like, you dream something happens,
I've seen this before.
And then you're like, I've seen this before. And you're like, I did have a dream about that one. Yeah, what is God showing me? Yeah.
Yeah, I used to have recurring dreams all the time.
She has dreams where it's recurring, but it's protecting her. So, like, she had a recurring dream through, like, for 10 years, how she was blocking somebody punching her. And turns out that came true because some crazy lady was trying to attack her. And she was able to remember, and she held up the right arm, the left arm, and the right arm again. Gosh. It was really interesting. So I was like, well, sometimes I guess the mind does that. But I wanted to say, well, it's God telling you.
Well, also in a lot of religions, especially in the Old Testament with Judaism and Christianity, if you had a dream, in the concept in Hebrew is that your mind is given access to the spiritual realm. So when you dream, sometimes I do believe it's our mind trying to make sense of stuff, but I do think sometimes God will reveal things, we forget them, and then when we see something, we're like, I've seen this before. What are you trying to show me?
And I might be crazy,
but
I've had dreams when I was like probably 7, 8, 9 years old about like something that happens. Oh, the storm. Speaking of storms, there's a storm outside, but it's where like, it's something stupid, like I'm moving a plate over here.
Yes, it's
I'm
image.
backing up and then setting something on a shelf. I remember having that as an 8, 7, 9-year-old, like 2 or 3 times or whatever.
Yeah.
And then I experience it when I'm 17. And I'm like, holy crap, this is the dream I've always had.
Yeah.
And it finally came true.
Yeah, I
don't know what condition that is.
I remember one time.
I don't know if it's special or if I'm special. I'm probably not.
I also think sometimes God gives us access to stuff.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes it's like God's not just a physical person I can go to, but I can feel his presence. You know what I mean?
And I have a crazy theory.
Okay, go for it. What's your crazy theory?
Because I've had dreams where like, I'm traveling in a tunnel Coraline style to different places. Like I remember I was working at the store and I had a dream where I was crawling through a tunnel and I popped out where I usually park by the store out of bushes. And I was like, I went in, did my shift. I came back. Everything was nothing out of the ordinary. And I came back and I was like, I'm not going to drive away. I'm going to go back in my tunnel. So I went back in my tunnel and I woke up and I'm like, holy crap, what a crazy dream.
What a crazy
dream.
And
I related it to, I transported to another dimension and I was embodying the Jake in that dimension and I couldn't go back to the car because the actual Jake's going to go back to the car. So I went back into the tunnel or whatever. So that's stupid, but it's just a fun thing.
I had that happen. I've had that happen into my 20s and my 30s. And I remember one time I was getting very little sleep because I was working 4 jobs and I had this dream that I was in class and it was this one student, it was the advanced students. And I saw this bag and Abdullah left without his bag. And then I had the dream again. And I'm like, hey, Abdullah, grab your bag. And 2 weeks later, I was standing in class. It was the exact same sun coming through the windows. It was the exact same position of students. They were wearing the stuff in my dream. And Abdullah started to leave. I'm like, Abdullah, you forgot your bag. And he goes, oh, thank you. And he was kind of an older guy. And the next day he came back and he goes, you know what, Angela? Thank you so much for telling me about that bag. I had $4,000 in there for our rent and a car and some other stuff.
Wow.
And he goes, I would have hated to forget. I said, we don't live in a high crime area, Abdullah. I said, but I knew that bag was important. I wouldn't want to leave my bag. But it was just weird.
That's cool.
It was like very weird. And I'm not going to knock spiritual stuff because they quote they quote.
Well, I think there's a connection
Hamlet in this.
Yeah, and I think there's a connection. Like for last thing I'll say on that, I think there's a connection between the subconscious and what God wants to tell you. And I feel like there's, I don't know how to explain it. There's some connection.
Even Carl and Jung and Freud said there is a subconscious.
Yeah.
There is an unconscious. And Carl Jung believed, the great psychologist, one of the fathers of like dream theory and stuff, he basically said, dreaming, sometimes we'll have dreams and people have the same dreams at different time because he believed there was a cosmic subconscious. And that's like a secular way of, I believe, looking at the way God ordered the world.
Like your spiritual self.
But it's interesting because they quote Hamlet twice, once in this episode and once in episode 9, where it's the famous line, there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than dreamt of in your philosophy. And it's basically him saying, how can I not see the ghost of my father? How do you know there aren't ghosts?
And the reason I brought up the lady in that conversation
that's
at work
fascinating.
Is because it's the same thing with the Dudleys, I think. This is my one issue with the series, because when you're trying to find a moral lesson in this show, which there are many, but if you try to find, and you're trying to connect the dots and figure out, and I'm going to talk more about this once we get to the end, but the Dudleys kind of represent, I understand why in the story they're written that way, because it's a great story, first off.
Yeah.
But I feel like when you try to find a moral lesson from this, the Dudleys kind of bring it back a little bit and make it a little bit worse because of what happens.
But they are good people.
But they are good people.
And this house has preyed on their family.
Yes.
Because the wife was taking care of one of the older people who owned the house, and she ended up losing their child.
I'm saying just the moral lesson from the show, the Dudleys kind of ruin a little bit. But I'm going to say that for the
last
end.
Episode.
But
I mean, let me tell you this. Tell me about the monologue and why this is one
of the
best monologues.
Goes on for like probably 4 or 5 minutes.
But why did they start having this conversation?
But they have this conversation because they're hearing the scratching the walls and the behavior of the house and the mom's behavior.
Olivia's really scattered. She doesn't.
Really scattered.
She's forgetting time.
Hugh asks for the plans for the house because she's a draftsman.
She's an architect.
And so she gives him the plan. She brings him. She says, "Oh, honey, I finally
because they're adding stuff on because they found the cellar with the alcohol and stuff."
Yeah, and so she brings him down the master plan,
and he looks at it.
And I can't remember what is on it.
It's basically
patterns.
It has we find out in the next episode. It's hundreds and hundreds of patterns of their forever house. That she didn't draw new stuff. She just drew that over and over and over again.
And he doesn't say anything right away.
No.
He saves it, but he's contemplating.
He notices.
Like, how do I talk to her about this?
Yes, and that's kind of
because he
dilemma.
starts realizing she is she is changing.
Well, and one night he wakes up and she's on his chest with a screwdriver at his throat. And he's like, "Liv," and she's sleeping. She's doing this in her sleep. Yeah. And Mr. Dudley the next day said, my wife, the reason we won't work here anymore at night is because my wife, kind of, if your wife feels like she's scattered.
Shut that window.
He goes, if your wife looks like she's scattered, I'll kind of go through this. And he goes, if your missus is acting scattered, he goes, maybe it's time that she takes a break. And Hugh's response is, mind your own business. This is my family. Because Mr. Dudley says basically, I don't have a right. And Hugh interrupts him and says, no, you don't have a right. And Mr. Dudley very calmly waits for him to get done being angry and says, when my wife first started working here, she would stay the nights and take care of old Mrs. Hill. And you find out old Mrs. Hill is one of the ladies that died upstairs where the twins were looking at this thing. And he said, but she'd come home scattered. And he said, my mother did the same thing because my mother cooked and cleaned for Mrs. Hill. And he said, my mother would go out in the woods giggling like a schoolgirl, like she was talking to a lover, and she was scattered. And he talks about his wife, and he goes into this long story. And it's just captivating the way the actor does it. He does such a great job. But he basically goes into this long story, and he says that my wife started coming back, and she would wake up with these screaming dreams, thrashing around. This woman lost a child and would keep working and go there. And so after that, we basically said, we're not coming after night. And he goes, because when she came back after she lost the baby, they would hear the baby that was never born because the baby was stillborn. They would hear the first cries of the child throughout the house. And he said, my wife is a tough woman, and she would wake up screaming. And so after that, we stopped staying the night, and it never happened again. And he goes, so if your missus is acting scattered, he's like, maybe she needs a break. And I think what's so beautiful about that monologue is not only is it well written and it captivates you, it's basically him relating to him, father to father.
Yeah.
Because he cuts him out. He just shuts him out at first.
Yeah.
And he's like, but if she's scattered, she might need a break. And that's the next thing he suggests her.
Yep.
Is that she's going to go spend some time with her sister.
It's so beautiful. Like just the monologue and the
term,
heartbreak. And I love
the two of them have
heartbreak. Yeah. And I love the term scattered because that it's not like, mentally ill people are, there's a lot of people have different issues, some serious, some not so serious, but scattered's the right phrase to use.
Yeah.
Because I equate it to like, this is a silly example, but bear with me. In the Wizard of Oz, where Scarecrow's like, they took my legs and threw them over there.
Oh,
they took my arms
he's scattered.
He's
Parts
scattered.
of him are in different
But
places.
I think it's a great analogy for people who are helping others. We brought this up in our mental health episode with Stephanie.
Oh, that was so good. You guys did a great job.
Where we said scattered is the right term to use because they are all there. They are all there, but they're having trouble finding themselves.
They're having trouble connecting
the dots. And whether this
dots.
be yourself and your own struggles with your mental health or others, it takes other people and prayer and God, I believe, to completely find inform your complete identity.
Yeah. And
because there's so many aspects and layers to that. And that's all I'll say on the scattered stuff.
We got to get to the last 3 episodes.
We got to get to the last.
Sorry, this may be the longest podcast we've ever recorded.
I think this might be the last one.